Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the Labor Day weekend 2024. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent nonprofit nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news, focusing on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news from our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. Today, we'll review the latest developments in the presidential race. We'll hear about the increase of sanctuary cities in the state of Virginia, and we'll look at the controversy over Meta's censorship and the Biden-Harris administration's role in it. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
He ran for state office and was beaten. Started a business and failed. Ran for Congress and lost. But thankfully, Abraham Lincoln didn't give up. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With the latest on the presidential race, it's our Dan McCaleb.
Vice President Kamala Harris gave her first sit-down interview since entering the presidential race when she was joined by her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, for a taped interview on CNN. Harris has been criticized for refusing to grant interviews and for several apparent flip-flops on her key policy issues. Joining me to discuss the race is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, you watched the CNN interview. What are your top takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, so it's an interesting interview. It's an interesting question. The obvious question is, was this a good interview? Was it good for the Harris campaign or was it good for the Trump campaign? And I think it depends on what the goal was. You might assume, and you might wrongly assume, that Harris wanted to make a big splash to get a lot of eyeballs on this interview and to put her policy out there, as you know, candidates are wont to do, to draw attention to their campaign and favorable attention, of course. But then I don't think that the CNN interview really accomplished that. In an era of viral media and 24-hour news cycles, a taped CNN interview is kind of a relic of 20 years ago. I mean, it's just not what it used to be. That would have been a major moment in a campaign, as I said, 20 years ago, but now it's just a blip on the radar. I thought, the interview was there's a lot of kid gloves in the interview. I mean, there were some, questions on tough issues for Harris, but it was hardly a tough interview. But you could say, Dan, that if Harris's goal, as it seems it may be in this campaign, is to largely avoid tough media moments and ride the momentum she has now to Election Day while avoiding mistakes, then you could say that this interview accomplished that. Because I suspect that one of her main goals was to silence critics who say she's not doing media interviews, but also she didn't want to do anything too risky, because I think in her mind she is winning and ascending on the way up. And so if her goal was don't make any mistakes and silence the critics who say I'm not doing enough media interviews, she succeeded. If her goal was to really change this race in a significant way, then she failed.
Well, let's talk about some of the specific issues she was asked about and some of the apparent flip-flops she's had on various issues. She was asked about fracking, energy. Pennsylvania is a big fracking state. It helps the economy. In 2019, Harris said she would ban fracking. in recent weeks since joining the race and on the CNN interview. She says her values haven't changed. She said that repeatedly over the past several weeks, but she says she would not ban fracking. That's an apparent flip-flop.
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, it's funny. I picked up on this theme of this campaign that it feels like it's being run with a strategy that would have worked 20 years ago. And right now it's working, but taking these major, policy issues or differences and kind of having a cutesy one-liner to kind of dismiss the press on it is sort of something you would have seen in the early 2000s. But yeah, that line about, well, my values haven't changed. So, okay, your values haven't changed, but these specific policies tied to those values definitely changed. So this feels like semantics. It's similar with, when Tim Walz in the same interview was questioned about, the basically lies that he's told. He's told a lot of lies over the years. I don't know if it's a lot. It's all just little details. It feels similar to Biden, just kind of making things up that weren't exactly true. Kind of hard to fact check some of them, but this seems almost like compulsive lying possibly. But when Tim Walz was asked about it, for instance, he said he carried weapons of war into war. He never saw combat, for instance. But he says something cutesy like, my wife, the English teacher, says my grammar's not too good all the time. I misspeak. And it's like, you lied about seeing combat, but you kind of had this cutesy one-liner about it. And so that's their strategy right now. So just be very prepared, kind of dismiss it. The press is not pushing them very hard at all. I think that we've talked about this before, Dan, but the press feels responsible for getting Joe Biden out of the race and Kamala Harris in his place. And I think they feel a sort of moral obligation to cover for Harris, because if Harris loses to Trump, it's sort of, they feel like it's their fault. Similar to how they felt it was their fault that Trump won in 2016, because they're almost entirely not even Democrat, but far left, the media is. So that's what's going on there. The flip-flop thing is interesting. I think that, though, I think Republicans might be making a mistake by focusing so much on that, because, again, I'm not to hammer too much this 20 years ago point, but John Kerry was hammered for being a flip-flopper against George Bush in that election, and it was a devastating attack then. But I'm not sure that just in this current media environment that it really is nearly as effective. I wonder how much it hurts her with the base and hurts enthusiasm that she has really backed off of her fracking ban. I think supporting tighter border security is actually smarter politically. It really neutralizes one of Trump's strongest attacks. And so I think it's politically smart. And you could say she doesn't have values or something, which maybe is true. But I think most Americans now assume these politicians don't have values. So if you're not going to have values and you're going to flip-flop, at least flip-flop the way that Americans want you to.
And we could talk, too, about the border. When she was asked about the ongoing border crisis, she deflected, blamed President Trump for saying he was opposed to this Senate bill, the Senate bill that went nowhere in the Democrat-controlled Senate. She was also asked about Biden and whether she had any regrets, saying right up until Biden exited the race that he was strong, he was a more than capable commander-in-chief, et cetera, et cetera. She said she had no regrets about that. Why don't we, in the brief moment that we have left, Casey, let's just turn to the polling. Harris does appear to have a slight lead over former President Trump in national polling. However, former President Trump does maintain leads in some of these key swing states.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so if you remember, we saw with Biden and Trump that Trump was winning nationally and in key swing states, and it was just basically set up to be a rout. I mean, Biden was significantly getting hit, but the latest, for instance, Harris is doing much better, leading by 1 or 2, maybe, for instance, the latest RCP polling average has Harris 48% and Trump 46.2% nationally. So, and that has actually grown in the recent weeks. So that lead that she has nationally is actually growing, which is bad news for the Trump campaign, of course. In Pennsylvania, Harris is up 0.8. In Wisconsin, it's 1.4. And even some of these gains she had are new. She wasn't necessarily winning this well in these swing states. So she is gaining momentum. Trump is still winning in Arizona, for instance. Let's see, I can pull up these others. In Georgia, they're dead tied. Exactly tied according to RCP. Michigan, Harris is up 1.7%. Nevada, Trump is up 0.3%. He's also up 0.3% in North Carolina. So he's still holding his own in these swing states, but his lead in these states has seemingly eroded as Harris builds national momentum.
Well, there's still, about 60 days until the presidential, a little over 60 days till the presidential election. Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with everything presidential related at the centersquare.com.
Big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the growth of sanctuary city policies, in particular in Virginia, it's Eliana Cardodal.
Sanctuary city policies are continuing to spread around the country. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Morgan Sweeney. Morgan, the Center for Immigration Studies looked into this. What did they find?
Yeah, so the Center for Immigration Studies is one of a bunch of think tanks, research institutions that I follow. Pretty typical for journalists. You know, we like to know when new information is out. And so they have a map where they try to record where sanctuary locations are throughout the U.S. And they just updated it recently. And it was a massive update because for a while they've been trying to use open sources and just kind of collecting information that way and using that to update the map. But this time they actually got access to an internal U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement document. And it's a document that ICE uses, their field offices use it to update, like who is not complying with their detainers. And so on that document, there's 551 institutions that do not accept immigration detainers that are listed. And then there's 146 institutions listed that accept them in a limited fashion. So they don't fully comply. So anyway, it led to a huge update for them. And with that update, beforehand, there were only 5 locations listed for Virginia as sanctuary cities. And then after the update, there are now 85 locations. Part of that is that a lot of these seem to be regional jail systems. And so each location that belongs to a regional jail is marked as, a sanctuary entity.
And part of the difficulty here is that it's not like places just necessarily come out and say, oh, we're a sanctuary city. How does that work?
Yeah, so in my experience, and I've heard this elsewhere too, most places don't call themselves sanctuary cities. And if you ask them about it, they might say they're not, even if they have policies like this in place. Because they say that there's no federal definition of what a sanctuary city is. That's how they get around that question. But if you press them more, they will often reveal some of the policies that they have that give them that status.
Is there a particular definition that this nonprofit uses when it's coming up with its map? Do they have a kind of specific way of determining what falls under that category?
Well, I think the way they determine it is just how ICE determines it, which is, is this institution, city, county, whatever it might be, are they complying fully with ICE detainers? And what that means is, so like on this detainer acceptance tracker that they got from ICE, there's non-cooperative institutions, which, like I said, there's 551 of those across the country. And then there's limited cooperation institutions, and there are 146 of those. So the non-cooperative ones, when ICE issues a detainer to like a jail, the non-cooperative ones will not notify ICE prior to the release of an offender. And then they also, this is obvious, but they also don't hold them for long enough for DHS to come and get them into their custody. So with a limited cooperation, these places will notify ICE prior to the release of an offender, but then they often don't hold them long enough for ICE to get custody of the person. So the Center for Immigration Studies, I mean, they pretty much follow that definition.
And like you mentioned, this isn't necessarily a new map. They've kind of been updating it over time. What's sort of the background on this?
The center began tracking sanctuary localities in 2015, and they use a combination of ICE records and open sources. And so since 2015, according to the center, more than 10,000 migrants have been arrested by local authorities for state and local crimes, but have been released back to the streets due to sanctuary policies like we're talking about, with a significant share later reoffending.
Well, Morgan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Morgan. You've been listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the federal government's role in social media censorship efforts, it's Dan McCaleb.
Meta and Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg conceded a huge admission this week when he said the Biden-Harris White House pressured his social media company to censor Americans, including right-leaning media, over issues such as COVID-19 responses and the Hunter Biden laptop. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, you wrote our story about Zuckerberg's admissions. What are your top takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, not only did I write this story, I've been covering this issue for a couple of years now, and it's slowly unfolded. And what, maybe the average American was too busy to keep up with, what Mark Zuckerberg is up to. But this is the admission that's been a long time coming. We've known for a while, Dan, that the FBI pressured big tech companies during the 2020 election to silence the Hunter Biden laptop story. The FBI told companies like Twitter, like Facebook, that this story, that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. It was a fabricated fake story, and they should silence it if it comes up during the election. So I believe it was October of 2020, the New York Post broke the story about Hunter Biden's laptop, and Twitter locked their account. The media called it basically a conspiracy. Just a few weeks out from the election, of course, that laptop was tied to a greater allegation of that Hunter Biden, possibly at the behest of President Joe Biden, was globetrotting, taking donations essentially in the name of influencing the Biden family. And so that the big tech shut down that story because the FBI pressured them to. And later it came out, of course, that the FBI, or that the Hunter Biden laptop was verified and totally true, not Russian disinformation. And now we have, in this kind of stunning admission, Mark Zuckerberg, who, leads Facebook, sent a letter to the House Judiciary Committee where he admitted it was a mistake to listen to the FBI, that he wouldn't do it again. And some of these quotes are pretty interesting, Dan. He talks about how the Biden administration repeatedly pressured our teams for months to censor certain COVID-19 content, including humor and satire, and expressed a lot of frustration with our teams when we didn't agree, end quote. So pretty interesting. Of course, it's not just the Hunter Biden laptop. COVID-19 was front and center with social media censorship, even questioning the vaccine, questioning masks could get your account, restricted or shut down. And now in the aftermath, we know that there was some harm with vaccines. We know that masks weren't nearly as effective as we were told. For instance, cloth masks do pretty much nothing. And so there's just there was a nuance to a lot of this dogma about COVID-19, but you weren't allowed to have any nuance in your posts. And so we're seeing Zuckerberg admit what people suspected all along. Not only has big tech been censoring people on huge issues like COVID-19, like, the last election, but it was doing so because the federal government, the law enforcement arm of the federal government, was pressuring them to do so.
So since all of that censorship, Casey, Elon Musk has purchased Twitter, renamed it X, of course, has said under his ownership, he will not agree to government pressured censorship. Mark Zuckerberg just this week comes out and says he regrets caving to some of this government pressure, said they'll be smarter going forward, will not cave. How does this change the social media environment when it comes to things like this? Do you think it will have any effect on the election?
Well, hopefully, I think it makes social media companies a little more distrustful of the federal government and willing to have a backbone to stand up to them. We've seen companies and, really wrestle with this issue. Like, should Apple turn over the phone password or a way to unlock the phone of someone who is accused of a crime? Should AT&T hand over phone records of different people? This is an ongoing question. I think, and I hope that these companies get more of a backbone. They're not intimidated. Of course, it will affect the election. These companies have a ton of influence over what posts people see. I mean, people spend a lot more time now on social media than they do on more traditional media outlets. And so social media has a huge impact on what information people consume, what ads they see for any election, what news articles they see, and how favorable those news articles are on either candidate. So they have a ton of control. Google, for instance, has been under a lot of scrutiny, Dan. We've talked about this as well. When you Googled certain candidates or certain issues, like for instance, Googling Trump, you might get a favorable story of Kamala Harris pop up. And you might say, well, that wouldn't really influence me. But in the aggregate, over, a 100-day election cycle, that will influence people. And in some of these swing states, you're only, a few thousand votes can make all the difference. And so when a company like Google, like these social media companies have this much power, it's not enough to just totally sink a campaign, but it is enough to play in the margins and swing some of these really important states.
Yeah, when it comes to Google, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, in the aftermath of the attempted assassination of former President Trump, if people were Googling it, they were getting some odd content on something as big as an attempted assassination of a former president and the GOP candidate for president.
Yeah, I mean, so if there can be such heavy-handed influence on an issue that important that we're paying attention to, just imagine how much can happen on less well-known issues. An energy worker in Pennsylvania is Googling what Kamala Harris really believes about fracking because he's heard mixed reviews. And so what do energy workers in Pennsylvania see, Dan, when their geolocated IP addresses search Kamala Harris fracking? Do they see the same thing as you and I see, either in DC or Chicago? We don't know. It's, possibly definitely not. I mean, they can certainly tailor search results by different things. So those are the kind of things that can really influence an election. And it's almost impossible to keep oversight over it. And of course, the current administration has no incentive to regulate that because these tech companies are very liberal. We know that. That's not just an assumption. We know, for instance, the political donations of employees at big tech companies are almost entirely Democrat. We have seen some leading tech, big tech leaders have come out more conservative, like Peter Thiel, like Elon Musk. But the run-of-the-mill Google employee who is setting these kinds of things is very likely Democrat or liberal. And so current administration, many of the bureaucrats who oversee these things who also tend to be liberal, that there's sort of an alignment of interests that support one party over the other. And I'm not sure what much can be done about it.
But definitely an interesting conversation. Casey, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. How is California expanding its down payment assistance program? What measures are some states taking to remove cell phones from the classroom? And should we be concerned about the jobs report revision that shows significantly fewer jobs were created in the past year than had originally been reported? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, better known as FIRE, is suing the city of Surprise, Arizona after resident Rebecca Massey was arrested for criticizing City Attorney Robert Wingo during a council meeting. Mayor Skip Hall interrupted her comments, citing a rule against complaints about city officials and ordered her removal when she asserted her First Amendment rights. Massey was charged with trespassing after questioning the grounds for her removal. FIRE argues that Massey's right to criticize public officials is constitutionally protected, and both Hall and Wingo are now facing public criticism and calls for their resignation. The Detroit Election Committee is being sued for appointing a disproportionately high number of Democratic poll workers in the August primaries, with reports of 2,337 Democrats and only 310 Republicans. This may violate Michigan law, which requires near equal representation from both major parties. The lawsuit filed by the Republican National Committee claims this imbalance undermines election integrity. It also notes that 200 of 335 precincts lacked a single Republican poll worker, despite qualified candidates being available. The RNC is demanding more Republican poll workers be appointed for the November general election to ensure fair representation. Organized retail crime in Illinois, including theft from railways, warehouses, and stores such as Home Depot and Walmart, is affecting taxpayers, retailers, and consumers statewide. Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul highlighted the widespread nature of these crimes and the state's effort to combat them through a task force established in 2021 and costing $5 million in fiscal year 2025. Organized retail crime cost Illinois an estimated $185 million in tax revenue in 2022. Retailers nationwide report a rise in these crimes, prompting collaboration among law enforcement and industry groups to address the growing issue. Recent data from the Virginia Public Access Project supports findings by the Reason Foundation, which show that higher school spending doesn't always result in better student outcomes. In some subjects, students from the 5 lowest spending school districts in Virginia outperformed or matched those from the highest spending districts, despite a significant gap in per pupil spending. For instance, in the 2023-2024 school year, 4th graders from lower spending schools had higher pass rates in reading and math than those from higher spending schools. This suggests that increased spending may not directly correlate with improved test scores. The University of Pennsylvania has implemented temporary restrictions for the 2024-2025 school year, banning encampments and overnight demonstrations. These measures were introduced to ensure safety and prevent disruptions, particularly after encampments protesting the war in Gaza emerged in April. The policy follows calls from Penn community members and recommendations from the university's task force on anti-Semitism and other groups. The new guidelines emphasize managing campus events while upholding Penn's commitment to free expression and preventing harassment or intimidation based on religion. A National Review article reports that at least 11 male convicts, many of whom have committed violent crimes against women and children, are housed at the Washington State Corrections Center for Women in Purdy. These men, identifying as women, have been allowed to transfer to the women's prison despite not undergoing transgender medical treatments. Allegations include multiple cases of sexual assault by biologically male inmates against female inmates. The Washington Department of Corrections responded by defending its transgender inclusive policy, stating it follows strict procedures to ensure the safety of all inmates. A new report by Policy Matters Ohio reveals that despite a significant post-COVID investment by the federal government and the largest wage increase in over 40 years, workers in Ohio are struggling to keep up with inflation. While the median wage rose to $23.95 an hour in 2023, up $1.55 over 2022, families face higher costs, particularly for groceries and housing. Although the unemployment rate hit a record low of 3.3% in 2023, it has climbed to 4.5%, and many Ohioans continue to feel the financial strain despite the economic recovery. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on California's expansion of their down payment assistance program, it's Eliana Curdodal.
The California legislature passed a contentious bill to allow for undocumented immigrants to use the state's zero down, zero interest home down payment program that provides $150,000 to qualifying participants. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Schrupp. Kenneth, tell us more about what this bill does and what the concerns are surrounding it.
Hey, Eliana. California has a program called the California Dream for All Shared Appreciation Loans Program, which is a fancy way of saying applicants can get, quote, loans of up to $150,000 or 20% of a home's purchase price, which is about what a typical down payment is, with zero down payment on this and no payments. So it's not really a loan. In exchange, the state gets the original loan plus 20% of the gains when the home is refinanced, sold, or transferred. So it's really the state is going to give you $150,000 or up to 20% of the home purchase price in exchange for repayment plus 20% appreciation. So it's really a home equity exchange program with the state. Now, this was funded last year with $255 million, and it ran out of money in just 11 days. There were 1,700 people who went through a lottery process to get to apply for this program. This year, program did not get any money because the state is in dire financial straits. So what's interesting this year is we decided to allow undocumented immigrants to now apply for this program. Given that the program doesn't have any money this year and already runs out so quickly, some have concerns that this puts a lot of extra pressure on a program that just doesn't have the bandwidth for millions of new people to apply.
So you mentioned it doesn't have money this year. So is it not open this year? Is it going to be open in future years? How does that work?
So let me just go back on an earlier point. This program actually only exists for people who can qualify for home mortgages. So it's not really likely that all too many of the state's illegal immigrants would be able to get a mortgage, right? Again, you have to be able to get a bank loan in the first place. You have to have your income presented. But going back to the question you said, is this going to be funded in future years? The state is facing several years of pretty bad revenue projections. And we do have a very narrowly avoided budget deficit of $47 billion this year. We did get through that through spending cuts, delays, and deferrals, but we probably won't have the revenue for this for some time. And I think what we're going to see is Newsom use what is his favorite tool for legislation that is popular within California, but maybe not so popular nationally, which is to say we don't have money for it right now. It's a quick, easy answer that helps him look like the moderate centrist on the national stage. His internal party members get to say that they put forward this bill that achieves some of their political or moral objectives, and everyone gets to go home happy. But again, I don't see funding for this program becoming available for quite some time.
And this bill, it's not quite law yet. Where is it in the legislative process?
This bill has passed the legislature and now goes to Governor Newsom's desk for approval. He has to pass or veto this bill by the end of September, which means we're going to have an answer very soon. This may or may not come with a veto letter. If it does come with the veto letter, it probably will say something like, we just can't afford this right now.
Well, Kenneth, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on state's effort to remove cell phones from classrooms, we'll go back to Eliana Kernodle.
As the school year kicks off, some states are considering banning cell phones in schools. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, Arizona and Montana are two places that are talking about this. What are they considering?
Basically, what they're considering is how do we get rid of cell phones in the classroom? And so in Arizona, the superintendent of public instruction, Tom Horn, is basically saying that students need to not have any cell phones at all in the classroom. And, that's coming from the leader of superintendent of public instruction there. And, in Arizona, they had a bill that was vetoed that would talk about this. But essentially, when you have somebody from the top saying schools need to do this, that's essentially what we have in Montana too. It's not like a hard bill of this is what you will do. It's more of the governor, Greg Gianforte there in Montana saying, we need to be focused on learning, and cell phones are distracting students and disrupting the learning environment. And so we need to get rid of them wherever possible, essentially having no cell phones like having policies where there are no cell phones. And so that was a letter to, school superintendents and school board trustees there in Montana. So these aren't, laws per se. These are saying from the top down, this is what we would like to see. And so I think could you like potentially have like school boards say like, oh no, we don't want to do that. Like maybe, and I don't know if there'd be any like legal repercussions because it's not, codified, but saying from the top, like we want it this way because we have these good reasons to do it. So you need to have that. I do think that like there was a lot of force, from the superintendent in Arizona, from the governor in Montana, that does have a lot of force. We have seen instances where, school districts like in, Oklahoma, and I think also in Arizona have defied the superintendent. And, so like, if they didn't do it, I don't know exactly what would happen. But essentially, there's been kind of a, groundswell of like support in recent years. And like really the last year, I would say, of states and, school districts saying like we're going to have even large school districts like New York City and Los Angeles Unified, I believe, saying like, okay, we don't want to have cell phones in our school districts. Chicago Public Schools, I think, is doing a similar thing. I could be wrong about that, but essentially, saying we don't want to have cell phones in schools. We want to have cell phone free policies so that kids are not distracted and they can learn.
Well, and isn't there some data behind that too of like a large majority of teachers say that it's a big concern?
Yeah, I think so. That, and I'm not sure exactly, what those points are, but I think that we've seen like a lot of teachers saying like, I can't get kids off of their phones. I can't get them to, engage with the schoolwork. And essentially too, if you have these policies that are sort of like, don't, like you can have your phone, but like don't take it out in class. Like who's left implementing those policies? Like who's left trying to enforce those policies? And it's the teachers saying like, you can't have that out. And like a kid's like, what are you going to do? Right. And then it kind of gets into like a very conflict. And then you have 30 kids in class and they're all saying, what are you going to do? Like how do you keep order that way? So if it's like a school wide or like a statewide, like you will not have your phone in here. Like it's against the policies, against state law. It's a little bit more maybe enforceable, saying like this is the expectation. So I don't know. I think that those kind of arguments are there, but we anecdotally, and I think what the research shows, teachers are having a hard time with these cell phones in the classroom.
Well, then what's some of the kind of the conversation surrounding these policies as to why are people opposed to them? What are concerns people are raising?
Yeah, I think that there's a number of concerns to that people have with these sorts of like top-down bans, cell phone like limits, and some of those are actually from parents who say that they want to be connected to their kid, and I do think that maybe part of it. I'm floating this out here. It might be that we've had a generation of people who have had a cell phone for a long time, a smartphone for a long time, and now their kids have smartphones and they're maybe going to middle school or high school and they want to have that contact that they've enjoyed with them thus far. And so now you're hearing from like a school district or from state officials, hey, we're not going to have that. You're not going to be able to reach your kid about something that's going on after school. Like that doesn't feel good, right? So I think that parents have generally pulled pretty hesitantly toward this. We covered this at Chalkboard, a few weeks ago, actually, that parents have pretty high disapproval rates of these kinds of cell phone bans because they want to be able to reach their kids and that they do like to have that kind of contact. I think that there's also the argument that's sometimes made that, we're going to have cell phones in your job, so you have to learn how to deal with them instead of, just getting rid of them completely, right? So instead of limiting them. And I think that you could kind of argue back and say, well, like these are kids. Like when you're an adult, you can make your own decisions, but these are kids and maybe they're not fully able to make their own kinds of decisions, especially with, if you think that social media is addictive and maybe manipulates the brain or kind of, does some of these things that are maybe even like chemically sort of akin to addiction, or that your cell phone is sort of like wired into that, then wouldn't it be better to remove those kinds of problems from the classroom? So I think that you can see how these arguments go back and forth, and that there's, a lot of heat on both sides trying to say like, well, this is what we think is right. It's one of those very contentious sorts of things, which, kind of seems small, but you can see how easily this would, totally derail a board meeting.
Yeah, and Arizona, they did try to take measures to implement this statewide in I believe it was the last legislative session.
Yeah, I think so, in April.
How did that go?
Yeah, so that was vetoed by Governor Katie Hobbs. So she vetoed it in April. And so it was, passed along party lines. Republicans were behind it and Democrats were opposed to it. Essentially, too, I think part of the argument that Hobbs had was that this was an unnecessary mandate. That's her language there. That, schools can kind of tackle this from case by case, like a county by county sort of level. I think too, there is an argument again, the critics of these sorts of statewide or large blanket bans on cell phones have is that parents want to be able to contact their kids, and shouldn't they be able to do that? So I think you can have it doesn't necessarily need to be partisan. I think that it kind of depends probably on where else is baked into the bill and what's kind of the temperature of the legislature. But I don't think that that's always a partisan thing there. In terms of, this is what parents say that they want. But then there's the research about here's what teachers say. And then also what are the effects on students? So, the Montana governor is citing this is how it affects student performance. And so I think that there's a lot of different kinds of research. There's a lot of different kinds of arguments. It's not that anything is wrong. I think it's just kind of it might be try and see, and do that. And then also implementation is difficult, right? It's hard to have these kinds of top level things and then put them into practice and make sure that they're being implemented and followed every day. Because I think that can be difficult too.
Well, Brennan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brennan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to dig into the jobs report revision, it's PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O. Hey, smart guy. Talk to me about this jobs report correction. There have been a lot of people that have sort of taken this up and I think are trying to score political points with it. I think I'm coming at this from a different direction. I mean, 818,000 jobs that were in the report or in the report data between, I believe it was March 2023 and April 1st, 2024. It seems like a massive miss. I mean, I've had complaints and concerns that I've shared with you, my friend, about the way that we count jobs in this country. And you have, kind of a little bit of Muhammad Ali, I think a little float like a butterfly, sting like a bee when we've talked about this.
Basically dismissed him. Dismissed him.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You dismissed him. You told me to go back and sit in the corner. So, here's the grid, man. I mean, that's almost 1 million. That's all. I mean, I'm being sort of generous and rounding up, but that's a lot of jobs. So what gives here?
The reality is if you take the monthly jobs created in that 12-month period, roughly 242 jobs per 1,000 jobs per month. And you compare that to what those revisions suggest we created on net over that 12-month period. It's about 175,000 jobs. And you basically have solid jobs growth. Monthly job growth that still exceeds or is roughly on par with what we were doing before the pandemic. And so you have a strong economy, an economy that's still growing. Remember, these revisions actually help to improve our understanding of what's really going on in the labor market and in the U.S. economy. They're nothing to be afraid of. It's actually normal. It's a very difficult job to collect the information, the data, and then making sure that an information is representative of everything that's going on in an economy of over 360 million people. And we are the best in the world at doing it, by the way.
Yeah.
And so I think it's kind of disingenuous for some of the people that are out there trying to score political talking points to point to that and say, oh, the economy is not doing great. Look, layoffs are low. The economy is growing. The share of prime working age Americans working today is higher than it's been in 20 years. The fact that employment growth, by the way, employment growth is jobs added on net, right? The fact that the increase is slowing, right, doesn't mean that the economy, that the employment number is not increasing still. It's in fact normal for the increase to slow down over time. There has to be a sky to this thing. There has to be a ceiling to this thing. We cannot continue to grow our employed population at a torrid pace like we did during those, the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. We are growing at a pace that is consistent with the increase in the population.
Yeah.
And that means we have a pretty strong labor market still.
Yeah, but these corrections can go one of two ways. I mean, a corrected number could go up or it could go down. I mean, it's gone down, and it's gone down not insignificantly. And one of the things that I've been sort of haranguing all along, and not haranguing you about, but I mean, I'm just haranguing on this one point, is that there is a significant percentage of the jobs that are being added that are taxpayer funded, that either direct government jobs, like, at the municipal, state, federal level, and then a lot of the healthcare jobs, because that gets shown as a sector, are jobs that have been added that are also taxpayer funded jobs because they're working with, people who can't otherwise afford healthcare. And I guess my overall concern is, and this is something that I think that we need to work on, and you and I need to kind of do some more research on. What were the real jobs that were added? Because I mean, you did say, like, when we were chatting about this the other day, when this data came out, you're like, yeah, the hospitality sector was one of the areas where, maybe the jobs were overstated. I'm not diminishing jobs in the hospitality sector, right? I mean, it's, and no, every job's important. Like, literally, I view it that way. Every job's important. I would also say that not every job that's inside of the government is necessarily, an absolute requirement. I would much rather see the private sector growing. To me, that would suggest that the growth was more meaningful, right? But I mean, what do you see inside of the data that sticks out to you?
I mean, the big revisions were in professional and business services. And I think we've talked about that. I think we mentioned time and time again that as the labor market slowed, a large share of the jobs that were being created were coming from a handful of sectors where basically employment hadn't regained, hadn't gone back to the levels, the pre-pandemic level, or at least the pre-pandemic trend. Now, it's interesting you talk about that because I actually looked at it. And what's interesting about that is that even if I kind of understand the argument, and I kind of agree with the sense that the fact that it would be nice to see more private payrolls increase, employment growth actually had not caught up to the pre-pandemic trend until recently, very much this year. And so, yes, I agree. But again, I think ultimately the U.S. economy remains on a pretty solid path that with higher interest rates, government job creation is likely to slow. And if it doesn't, it probably will have to at some point.
Right.
Because basically the cost of government spending has increased.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. The Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network, produced by Eliana Kernodle. If you missed today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug, and on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.